Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the second installment of our traffic safety series, brought to you by the New Hampshire Office of Highway Safety, AAA of Northern New England, and the Injury Prevention Center with the Children's Hospital at Dartmouth-Hitchcock. Today's panel discussion will focus on different areas related to speed management. My name is Jennifer Tramp. I'm the Public Information Officer for the Office of Highway Safety. Before we get started, let's go over a few housekeeping items. This session is being recorded and will be available for viewing on our YouTube channel. You can find us at NH Office of Highway Safety. There will be time for questions at the end of all presentations. During the presentations, you can submit your questions via the Q&A chat panel that is located to the right of your screen. If you're looking for a certificate of completion for continuing learning education credits and you're a driver's ed professional, you can contact Chelsea Mostoni. For all other traffic safety professionals, you can contact me, and our contact information will be found in the chat box, again, to the right of your computer screen. Lastly, please take our survey at the end of the session to let us know how we can improve your webinar experience. We have a great panel lined up for you, and without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Jeff Landy.
State trooper and a field representative and law enforcement liaison for the New Hampshire Office of Highway Safety. Nationwide, speed is moving back into the forefront as a leading cause of fatal crashes. Within New Hampshire in 2020, 39 fatal crashes were speed-related, resulting in 41 fatalities and accounting for roughly 41% of all fatal crashes. 19 of those speed-related fatal crashes also had an indication of drug and/or alcohol impairment. 3 speed-related fatal crashes also had an indication of distraction and/or inattention. And 15 of the 25 motorcyclist fatalities were speed-related. So we definitely have a problem with speed in the Granite State. Since we don't have a lot of time here today and we have great presenters for you, we want to jump right into it. If time does allow, as Jen said at the end, we can open it up to questions for each presenter and some discussion. Our first presenter, William Lambert, will present on speed limits and setting state speed zones. Bill worked as a consultant engineer for 7 years prior to joining the New Hampshire Department of Transportation in 1993. He has been the state traffic engineer and administrator with the NHDOT Bureau of Traffic since 2000 and is currently serving as the chairman of the State of New Hampshire Speed Management Task Force. Bill, take it away.
Welcome to the speed presentation, everybody, and thanks for that introduction, Jeff. We're going to start the discussion to have a discussion about speed limits and setting state speed zones. And in New Hampshire, that's a Commissioner of Transportation responsibility, and it's delegated to the state traffic engineer or me. So what I'd like to, there's my contact information that you'll see again later. What I'd like to do is talk about the relevant speed limit statutes so that everybody understands how they apply to the speed limits, how we determine state speed zones in New Hampshire, why it's important to set credible speed limits, and then if we have time, or if I have time, go over some recent case studies where we've actually increased speed limits to reflect the reasonable and safe standard for the road. And I'd also like to talk about the relationship from a traffic engineering perspective between the speed limit and other highway devices such as warning signs, guardrail, and things of that nature. So the relevant speed limit statutes in New Hampshire, the rules of the road are under Chapter 265, and the basic rule and maximum limit for speed limits is under Statute 265-60. Which describes or defines the reasonable and prudent standard. And I've got it up on the slide. It's essentially that no person shall drive a vehicle on a way at a speed greater than is reasonable and prudent under the conditions and having regard to the actual and potential hazards then existing. So realistically, the speed limit should be the maximum value, and the reasonable and prudent standard would tend to indicate that when you have less than ideal conditions, people should lower their speed. I think in a lot of cases, and in people challenging speed violations, they use the other example that that driving faster than the posted speed limit in certain conditions was reasonable and safe because they weren't in a crash, so that must have been safe. So that has tended to be stretched a little in, I guess, the public perception. The statute also goes on to say that in every event, speed shall be so controlled as may be necessary to avoid colliding with any person, vehicle, or other conveyance on or entering the way in compliance with the legal requirements and the duty of all persons to use due care. And I've often said that, especially this time of year when you've got state police pulling vehicles out of snowbanks in any snowstorm, that every one of those drivers should be getting a speeding ticket, because by definition they were driving at a speed beyond what they could control the vehicle. So the statutory speed limits under that statute, the basic rule, are as follows. It defines a school zone speed limit, which is essentially 10 miles an hour less than the normal speed limit before school starts and then after school releases. But then the statutory value speed limits are 30 miles an hour for a business or urban residence district, which are also defined in statute, and that's a pretty high standard. You're thinking city street or a downtown, not like a Miracle Mile commercial zone, but a downtown. We've got on-street parking and crosswalks and things of that nature. It's 35 miles an hour for rural residence district, which is more suburban. It's not, some have argued that you've got a stretch of road that only has houses on it, should be a rural residence district. But if they're only one every 2,000 or 3,000 feet, then that's not by the definition. It also defines the speed limit on the divided highways, which is 65, except for the legislature increased the speed limit to 70 north of Concord several years ago. And then by statute, all other speed limits are 55 miles an hour. So when you're on a road and you see a speed limit of 40 or 45, that is not a statutory speed limit. That's what I'll go into next, is a state speed zone. So in the statute, in 265-62, the Commissioner of Transportation has the authority to determine state speed zones based on actual conditions. And that authority is delegated to the state traffic engineer. And per statute, it requires an engineering and traffic investigation. And while that term is not defined in statute, it's defined in practice, and the DOT follows accepted traffic engineering practices for engineering and traffic investigation. The Federal Manual and Uniform Traffic Control Devices also has some applications for speed limits, and it recommends in the second bullet that you see on the slide that when a speed limit within a speed zone is posted, it should be within 5 miles an hour of the 85th percentile speed of free-flowing vehicles. So how do we determine state speed zones? The components of the engineering and traffic investigation include, by law, by the federal law, the speed study, or the analysis of the speed, the free-flowing speed of vehicles on a segment. Horizontal and vertical geometry is certainly considered, but generally that comes into play in the measured speed, traffic volume, crash history, the length of the segment, the number of lanes and the lane width, and the offset to hazards. And the speed study is the one that we collect in the Department of Transportation. The other things are entered into a web-based program called US Limits 2, which uses algorithms from similar segments across the country to determine a recommended speed limit. So the engineering and traffic investigation, the 85th percentile, that's based on research that was done many years ago, but it's still fairly valid, and nobody's necessarily disputed it since that time, although there are some urban areas that are trying to go more with a 50th percentile. It compares the relationship between the average speed and the collision rates of automobiles, and it's generally regarded as the reasonable and prudent standard with regard to speed limits. And like I said, the MUTCD will say that the speed limit should be within 5 miles an hour of that measured 85th percentile. And I guess the graphic is shown here on the screen, where you've got the speed distribution is the bell curve. So you've got the average speed, and then you've got speeds on either side of that. They tend to taper off at the bottom of the bell in either direction. And then the crash risk curve, based on the research, showed that the low point of the crash risk curve was at 85 to 90% percentile of the measured speed. So the lowest risk was slightly above average, and that's why the speed limit tends to be set at the 85th percentile. It also means, from a law enforcement perspective, that if you've got 85% of the vehicles doing less than the posted speed limit, then the law enforcement can focus on the high-end violators that are the 15% that are greater than that. Another factors that are considered in that investigation, like I said, crash history, the geometry, and then continuity with neighboring speed zones and the length of the segment. Law enforcement tends not to like to have a what we call a roller coaster speed limits that go up and down over a segment that's fairly uniform. Although over the years, I think we've got speed zones that tend to look like that. And I said that we've used the US Limits 2 web-based program developed by Federal Highway. So why is it important to set credible speed limits? The reason that it's important to set credible speed limits is that individual drivers control their speed according to perceived and actual conditions. And if you presume that most of the drivers are reasonable and prudent, and you set the speed limit at that value, then most people are voluntarily complying with the speed limit. Posted speed limits indicate the maximum legal speed for a specific roadway segment. Unreasonably low speed limits are not respected by drivers, law enforcement, or the courts. We continually hear that courts won't cite people or convict people for speed limits or speeding at less than 10 or 15 miles an hour below the posted speed limit. So in effect, the judges are determining what the speed limit should be because from their perspective, the posted speed limit is not credible. Other elements include curve warning signs and passing zones that we have on the highway are determined based on the posted speed limit. So the challenge that we have, that I have setting speed limits, is that the law says that the speed limit is what's shown on the right is the maximum value that you should drive in a particular segment of highway. But the culture tends to treat it as a minimum. I can't tell you how many times I hear complaints about, even in my own family when I'm riding somewhere, about people that aren't even driving the speed limit. My wife complains about me driving the speed limit all the time because the perception is that that's the least you should do on a segment unless there's some a snowstorm or something else to slow you down. So that perception is hard for us to overcome. And it's important, I think, to address that culture by setting speed limits that are credible for the actual conditions and not some arbitrary value below that we hope will allow law enforcement to convict folks. So that's a challenge for us. And I don't know if people are aware of this, but there's bills in the state legislature to increase speed limits to what people think is appropriate. And like I said earlier, if judges are providing a tolerance above the posted speed limit, which then means that that's what law enforcement is enforcing, it's not the state traffic engineer or the commissioner of transportation that's setting the speed limit. It's the courts and just the ability of the law enforcement to gain a conviction. So that's a challenge, that try to come up with a credible speed limit for the conditions, but one that can be enforced by law enforcement. So they've got some examples coming up of speed limits that have been lowered in the past, but did not result in lower speeds. And in some of these locations, we've actually gone back and increased the speed limit either to what is reasonable and safe for the ideal conditions, or to make a more uniform speed limit over several segments. So Candia Route 27, if you see it on the screen, you've got Candia 27 goes from Hooksett towards Raymond. The center of Candia is right in this area where there's a traffic signal. And west of there, going towards Hooksett, had been posted at 35 miles an hour for a number of years, especially in this last segment just before you get to the town line. The speed limit coming in from Hooksett is 45, and then beyond that, going towards the center of town, goes to 45. But there's a short segment that was posted at 35, presumably because there's a large, I guess, commercial attraction in this area, Charming Fair Farm, that generated some traffic over the years and convinced folks to lower the speed limit. Well, the character of the road doesn't change in this whole segment. So people are driving along a road and it doesn't change. And there was a short segment that was posted at 35. Somebody locally had suggested that should be reconsidered. And I worked with the police chief and we did the studies. And we found that the speed values in that area really didn't change when the speed limit was dropped. If you see the data that I've got on the screen now, eastbound and westbound traffic were both a little over 45 miles an hour when the speed limit was posted at 45. So lowering the speed limit in that area didn't affect the lower speed that people wanted to. And the graphic that I find really drives that home is this is the speed distribution of that particular area. And the speed limit is here at 35 miles an hour. And 35 miles an hour captures less than 5% of the people on the road. So how credible a speed limit is that really for the conditions? Hooks it in Route 3 and 28 and Hooksett, north of kind of the developed area of Hooksett going towards Allenstown. There's a segment of road that's posted at 40 miles an hour. And there really isn't anything along this road that would warrant 40 miles an hour, other than there's a driveway with a subdivision of 4 houses on a combined driveway. And this wasn't a speed study that we did, or we've changed the speed limit, but it's one that I bring up a lot because there was a speed study done for a private development in this area that was done by a third party, not by DOT. So it's not my data, and I don't want people to think that I'm biasing the data in one way or the other, but it was provided by an outside party. And if you can see the data that they presented, you've got the speed, measured speed in 2006, I think it was. The average speed is a little over 52 miles an hour, and the 85th percentile is 58. So dropping that speed limit to 40 miles an hour did not affect a reduced speed. And kind of the poster child for speed management or credible speed limits for me is in Wakefield on 153, where the police chief reached out to me to share his concerns with enforcing the speed limit on this section of road that goes from Route 16 on the south end of town, and then broken for the village part, but then continues on into the state of Maine and up towards Effingham. And the whole road was posted at 35 miles an hour. And most of that was posted because along that route, there were a number of fairly sharp curves that you really couldn't drive at anything higher than that. But the road didn't change. It was a fairly rural, low volume road. So the police chief said that his concern with enforcing it is if he pulled somebody over at 45 to 50 miles an hour, they were essentially doing what he thought was reasonable and safe for the roadway. And he felt that was unfair. So if you pulled them over at 60, which he thought was speeding, now they're at 25 over the posted speed limit and given a higher fine for that. So we worked together. We did the speed data, and you can see one of these sections here, and I'll show you the other couple, where the 85th percentile was measured at the mid to high 40s. And this is the lower part of the village where it's a straight shot. So it's not, there's no geometry to slow people down in this area. And if you look at the other examples, again, the 85th percentile speed is in the mid 40s. So we met with the town board of selectmen and the chief, and we agreed that 35 miles an hour was too low, and we posted it with 45. And before we made that physical change, we actually looked at all the horizontal curves that were the reason for the lower speed limit in the first place. And we added because of the 45 miles an hour, we added the curve warnings for for those locations. And we added something like 200 bright yellow signs to tell people why they should slow down at those particular curves. So to me, that was more appropriate than putting a black and white sign at either end and hoping that they would follow it. And I'm going to skip over the next couple. Hancock was just an example where we had 4 or 5 speed limits over a short segment. The road pretty much looked the same. So we went back and posted it at a uniform 50 for the whole length. The Kankamangas Highway that most people are familiar with, it was dropped at 40 again because of the nature of, it was a seasonal road when it was posted at 40. But people on the straight sections of the road were doing a lot more than that. So we changed that to 50. Wilmot was an example where somebody asked us to close a passing zone, but the zone, the segment had enough sight distance for passing it to post at 35 miles an hour. But if people were actually doing closer to 45, in this case over 50, they didn't have adequate passing sight distance to make an informed decision. So we increased the speed limit to 45 and then closed that passing zone. So that leads me to the closing remarks of talking about the speed limit relationship to other traffic control devices. And namely, it's passing zones, curve warning signs, and pedestrian crossings. So in passing zones, when we look at passing zones, unless there's a lot of driveways or roadways in the segment, we're looking primarily at passing sight distance. And you can see from this table from the manual and uniform traffic control devices that the higher the speed limit, the more passing sight distance you need. So if the speed limit reflects what the prevailing traffic is, then we end up closing passing zones that would have been open and otherwise. And the change that we made in the CANC that I mentioned earlier, going from 40 to 50 miles an hour, that resulted in closing 7 of 8 passing zones in that segment. So you could argue that that's more of a safety benefit than the black and white sign on either end. And curve warning signs, this is the table that we go with as far as determining what the appropriate curve warnings are. So across the top, it shows the difference between the speed limit and the advisory speed. And in the matrix, it tells you whether certain signs are recommended or required. And our practice is to put everything that's recommended. So if the speed limit is fairly low, is lower because that's what we want people to do, then a lot of times that measured advisory speed is going to be equal to or greater than the speed limit, and you end up not having the curve warning signs that are required. So if that posted speed limit captures 85% of the vehicle on the road, then you know that the curve warning signs are going to be appropriate for all but the most extreme speeders on the road. That's the kind of image that I think is more effective at getting people to slow down for a curve than a black and white sign before it. And the pedestrian crosswalks, I didn't mention that, but when we look at pedestrian crossings, we don't approve marked crosswalks at 35 miles an hour or less, unless it's 35 miles an hour or less. A lot of people have asked when we've denied crosswalks for higher speed limits is just lower the speed limit so you can put a crosswalk there. Well, if it's not making people go slower, then you're actually putting pedestrians more at risk. So again, having a credible speed limit gives us a better, I guess, understanding of the conditions where we might require more signing or beacons for a pedestrian crossing. And that's all I have. And I guess we're going to get to questions at the end. So I am going to stop sharing.
Well, thank you very much, Bill. Much appreciated. Next up, we have EVP Associates Russell Pildes and Jenna Goldberg. They'll be presenting on analyzing rural road safety, a geographic analysis. Russell Pildes is a geographer, planner, and policy analyst specializing in translating technical analysis into policy decision-making. And Jenna Goldberg has extensive technical expertise with economic data analysis and visualization for academic research projects, as well as providing insights for public and private entities. Russell and Jenna. Are you guys on mute?
One moment, please.
Okay.
Hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now, Russell. I think we're good to go.
Okay. That. All right. Thank you, Jeff, and thank you to everybody for having us here today. We can skip over our introductions because I think got that covered. Thank you again, Jeff. But as you mentioned, my name is Russell Pildes, and I'm here with Associate Jenna Goldberg, and we're going to present some results that we've from some work we've been doing for this BTSCRP 15, which is entitled Highway Safety Behavioral Strategies for Rural Areas. This presentation is going to be a little bit of alphabet soup, so I'm going to take a minute here and try to level the field, make sure everybody knows some of these acronyms that we're talking about. So for those who do not know, the National Academies of Science and Medicine has an arm known as the Transportation Research Board, or TRB, that researches loads of different topics through various mechanisms and committees. And one of those mechanisms is the Cooperative Research Program, or CRP, which combines a research topic, a panel of experts on that topic, and a research team. The CRP that we're talking about and that we're working on is Behavioral Traffic Safety, or BTS. which is confusing because the Bureau of Transportation Statistics is also BTS. But, the panel selects a question. The researchers, which can be public, private, or academic, propose approaches for answering that question. And then the selected research team, which in this case includes us at EBP, conducts the work that the panel then reviews, and ultimately TRB publishes the results in a report, which in this case is BTSCRP 15. The purpose of this CRP is to develop a toolkit for practitioners to select behavioral countermeasures, some of which we may have heard about in the last presentation, as well as others, to reduce crashes, injuries, and fatalities specifically in rural areas, which has been a big priority for federal government lately as well. We often talk about physical countermeasures like railings and bollards and protected bike lanes and signs, but clearly, as we heard, driver behavior matters. But what is the difference between a rural road and an urban road? And what effect does that have on safety before we ever get to talking about countermeasures? That's what we're here to talk about today. That's what our research has been about distinguishing this image on the left from these on the right. So that's our agenda for today, is to talk about our approach to classifying rural areas, classifying rural roads, and then the results of our safety analysis.
So first thing to get into is to talk about what a rural area is. And usually this is a very binary definition of you're in an urbanized area or you're not and you're in a rural area. But what we wanted to do was to develop a more nuanced classification system that looked at many different kinds of rural areas. So what we ended up with here on, I believe, the next slide is a classification system that involves 9 county types. And that seems like a lot, but I'll break it down a little bit. On the left side, we have a group of 5 types with definitions that are based more on physical attributes. Metropolitan areas, for example, have an urban cluster of at least 50,000 people. It's actually a pretty low threshold defined by the federal government office OMB, which I'm forgetting the acronym definition for.
Office of Management and Budget.
Thank you. I knew you would know that one. Micropolitan areas right below it have urban clusters of 10 to 50,000 people. So again, it's a pretty low threshold, but it is pretty significant. And then we have things like remote towns, which are defined by really low population densities and so on and so forth. And then on the right side, we have different kinds of rural area definitions that are based more on socioeconomic attributes. So tribal counties have most of their land being tribal areas. Older age counties have more than 1/3 of their population. It's actually a very high percentile threshold there of their population is senior citizens, people over the age of 60. And destination counties are based on high levels of recreational industry activity and high levels of migration and seasonal housing. I do have an appendix slide that goes into some more detail about the definitions and how we classified all the counties, but I'll save that for the Q&A if anybody's interested. And now we can show you guys what happens when we look at counties in New Hampshire. And the big thing to point out here is that, yes, most of the southern part of the state is metropolitan, because those thresholds are relatively low. Remember, we're only talking about cities of at least 50,000 people here. So I know that some people might disagree with that, but that's the definition that we use. But in the northern part of the state is something that makes New Hampshire really unique, is that we have 3 counties of the destination type. And that's because, and as you all probably know, a lot of skiing and a lot of hiking in beautiful rural New Hampshire. And that has a lot of interesting impacts on driver behavior and thus safety. But it's important to talk about what this actually means and some of the trade-offs of our county-based system. The counties are really large and diverse areas. I mean, a good example of this is to talk about Merrimack County, which is sort of in the southern center part of the state where Concord is. It's a pretty reasonably sized city, but also in the same county, you have some state parks, lots of great rural areas where you can take a hike. And as a result, not all parts of the county are going to be like Concord. It's very diverse, but the most dominant classification for most people in that county is to say that they live in a micropolitan area. But this creates some challenges because counties can fit criteria for multiple categories. And the overlap between definitions means that the order of classification in our system is very important. And there's a lot of subjective arguments to be made in here. You can consider a destination county here that's largely defined by the presence of a big skiing community. And then you have to weigh that against some of the other physical and year-round attributes of the communities there. So broadly, we decided that we would allow these more socioeconomic definitions like destination and older age to be dominant over the physical area definitions like fringe counties, which are bordering metropolitan areas. We thought that the socioeconomic characteristics were more dominant and in many cases more specific than the physical characteristics there. But one of the biggest advantages of our system and being based on counties is that we get to take advantage of a lot of really broadly available data on safety. So our next slide here shows the percentage of fatal accidents that are speeding related. This is based on national data from the Fatal Accident Reporting System, also known as FARS. This shows you the average percentage of crashes, of fatal crashes in each county types that involve speeding. And there are two data points here that are probably of interest to New Hampshire. One is that destination counties, of which there are 3 in New Hampshire, have a really high percentage of speeding related fatal accidents, especially compared to the national average of like 20%. And we can hypothesize a little bit about why this is. So we can attribute this to a lot of behavioral factors, such as lack of driver familiarity with safe behavior on snowy or mountainous roads. And it can be very easy for less experienced drivers to go at a much higher speed than is safe on curvy roads and different kinds of terrain, and they may be useful. I'm also going to briefly discuss what's going on in rural towns. At the bottom, there is a county in New Hampshire that fits that definition, Sullivan County, if you're keeping track. I think that this low percentage is probably a function of lower speeds on roads in population centers, places that are more likely to have intersections that contribute to a lower operating speed. So now I think we've given an interesting primer on how we define different kinds of rural areas, but we do have to go back to talking about roads.
Right, because we have to, both of these things matter when we're talking about safety in rural areas. So we'll talk a little bit about how we classify, the approaches to classifying roads in rural and urban areas, making this distinction before we talk about the results of our safety analysis. There are 2 major families of classification systems for roads. We're going to talk about both. One is design-oriented and the other is safety-oriented. Design-based systems, the phrase we want you to remember is functional classification. The concept of functional classification, I'm reading from FHWA guidance when I say this, the concept of functional classification defines the role that a particular roadway segment plays in serving the flow of traffic through the network. So simply put, functional classification guidance includes ways to distinguish different kinds of roads for different purposes. You've got local roads, which lead away from your house, from the end of your driveway. You have collectors, where all the local roads start to feed into those. And then you have those feed arterials, and the largest arterials that you can think of are the major interstates and state county highways. Functional classification guidance includes ways to distinguish between urban and rural roads, but 2 things to remember. One is that the distinction is just urban and rural. And as Jenna was just describing, there's a lot of differences between areas that are urban, that are rural. It misses all of the nuance there. And even where they distinguish between urban and rural, the differences in principle aren't substantial. Lane width, speed, the number of lanes, amount of traffic, whether it's access controlled, those are the major determinants of functional classification. And the key thing to remember is that the purpose drives the classification, which then drives the design. There's a linear pathway here that's important to remember. But this is a little bit abstract, so I'm going to run through a quick example of an illustrative example of how this plays out in space. And so this image here on the left of the slide here is of the road network in Boston, as well as a little bit of Cambridge. You can actually see my house on here. If you have a look at the thickness of the lines in this map, you can see that there are about three classes of road, including interstates, which are the really thick lines, and arterials, which are slightly less thick, but most of it's local streets. This means that the full mix of users is mostly using local streets. So heavy combination trucks delivering groceries to the grocery store, driving on the same roads as those preferred by pedestrians and cyclists, which definitely can slow things down because the lanes are narrower and the spaces are tighter, which may increase safety, but it is also pretty cramped, which might decrease safety. And there have been a number of high-profile crashes with cyclists and pedestrians being killed by heavy trucks, combination trucks driving on local streets. Now, if we compare that to this image here on the right, which is of Leicester, which is in England, and I chose it because it's also a medieval city, much like Boston, with all sorts of squiggly roads that used to be cow paths. And Leicester also has the same population density as Boston, so it's a good comparison. I can notice how there are still three prominent scales of road here, but there are also more distributed. Local roads feed the arterials, and those feed the highways that lead across town and out of town. All of this is the outcome of functional classification and the choices we make about how to distribute traffic on road networks. The thing to remember is that with functional classification, geometric and operational characteristics take precedence, that roads with higher volumes, higher speeds, and a greater emphasis on mobility rather than accessibility have wider lanes, tend to include things like shoulders, and facilitate what highway engineers would call uninterrupted service. And as we'll see in a moment, the guidance directs planners and engineers to subsequently match countermeasures to operational conditions rather than earlier in the design process when functional classification is taking place. So we talked about design. Let's talk about safety-based classifications, or classifications that might arise from safety analysis, like we heard Mr. Lambert talking about earlier. So while functional classification does this prospectively to distinguish roads, safety analysis considers crashes and their causes retrospectively to select mitigation strategies. You can see that in this chart here, which comes from the Federal Highway Administration. I don't think this is in the Highway Safety Manual, but it's in an accompanying document. I'm forgetting the name right now. Office of Safety Guidance on Safe indicates that strategies may include design changes, but most of this is happening as part of transportation systems management. The key points to remember are that this is downstream, as shown in this diagram. It's happening downstream of functional classification, that it's incident focused, and that physical characteristics are largely assumed to be fixed or exogenous to the analysis. I know there are engineers in the audience who may have examples where this isn't true, but in a lot of the literature we've read and working with planners and engineers ourselves, we know that this is often an assumption that's made. It's important to remember that that's traditional. Any classification system arising from standard safety analysis evaluations would focus on information generalizable to similar incidents, not to similar roads, which is critical to our analysis that we're going to talk about, because you can see that we have design systems and safety systems don't really necessarily talk to each other. This table here comes from the Highway Safety Manual, and these are all the different kinds of parameters that you would need in order to conduct a safety analysis. And some of them come from functional classification because they're design focused, and some come from safety analysis. You don't necessarily get both from just doing one. So we need to figure out how to address safety concerns using both of these things to do this CRP analysis and make a toolkit. So in order to, we need, I guess I've sort of said what I was going to say. So Jenna's now going to talk about our analysis.
Right, yes, thank you. In order to further unravel the impact of different physical road infrastructure on different kinds of roads and different kinds of counties, we developed a predictive model that estimated the number of crashes on road segments in non-metropolitan counties using this data source called the Highway Safety Information System, or HSIS. The data that we used was for Washington State for the years 2016 to 2018. And I know, and you all know, that Washington and New Hampshire are pretty different states in many different ways. But for the purposes of our conversation today, it's important for you all to know that they actually have very similar county types under our rural area classification system. So New Hampshire has an older age county and a bunch of destination counties. So does Washington. They're both in pretty northern parts of the country, lots of skiing and hiking places. So for these purposes, we can think that road behavior, even in these two very different states, can be somewhat comparable. So we ran this model and we controlled for a number of different things in iterative runs. But one of the first things that stuck out to us on the next slide is that the role of speed and crash incidents on non-interstate arterials. So these are pretty high speed roads, but they're not the biggest highways in the country. Speed limit on these roads was found to be negatively correlated with crash frequency. And this, at first glance, is sort of a counterintuitive finding. But you can consider here two kinds of arterial roads. One has maybe a lower speed limit and one's a little bit higher. However, there are other physical factors at play here that contribute to a higher level of risk on the lower speed arterials. They're more likely to have more intersections. They might be in higher density urban areas. And as a result of that, they could have smaller lanes. All of that would contribute to a higher incidence of crashes. So that's one of our interesting findings we found with relation to speed. But when we go into the most remote areas, we almost see the opposite happen, where crashes are more likely to occur on high-speed roads. And I know that in New Hampshire, in our classification system, we didn't point out any specifically remote counties, but we all know that there's some very remote parts of the state. So I think that this is still important to talk about. When we focused our model on the most remote parts of Washington, we learned that crashes on high-speed roads are more likely. And we also know that crashes that occur at higher speeds are more likely to result in serious injuries or fatalities. So we have to figure out what's going on here. And unlike our prior discussion, which focused on physical factors that influence speed, remote area driving in our hypothesis is more largely influenced by behavioral factors. And these could encompass a number of things. On the next slide, we have sort of a list of some of the behavioral factors we think are at play. For example, there's just less going on, so drivers might be more susceptible to distractions. It's more difficult to enforce speed limits. We talked in the previous presentation, there was some discussion of whether a speed limit is viewed societally as a minimum or a maximum. I think on extremely remote roads, people are more likely to be going above the speed limit, and it's very difficult to enforce that. So depending on the geography of the area, behavioral factors can really make a big difference. And that's what we're going to talk about in our study in further time. So I just want to sum up what we've gone through in this presentation a little bit, and we're coming to the end here. One thing I want you to remember is that destination counties, of which there are several in New Hampshire, have some of the highest proportion of speeding-related fatal accidents. I think that's a very important finding from our research. But I also want to acknowledge that our analysis is not the end-all be-all. This traffic safety analysis can be very localized, and it's important in order to create a more specific body of research to have access to a lot more public data. And a lot of DOTs probably have a lot of numbers sitting around, but because they're not publicly available, it's not always possible to do this kind of research on all 50 states. And maybe someday that will be possible, and I look forward to that. But for now, we can say that both societal and physical environments matter and have impacts on safety, and in some places one is more dominant than the other, and that behavioral factors such as speed limit compliance are very important in rural areas. So I hope that after all this, if you have more questions, and I'm hoping that we get some good ones during the Q&A session at the end here, but just in case, you can feel free to contact us if you have more questions about our research here. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Russell and Jenna. Our final presenter today is James C. Tasse, PhD, who will present on vulnerable road users as it relates to speed and bicyclists. James is a nationally recognized bicycle pedestrian safety educator and advocate. He is currently the Assistant Director of the Bicycle Coalition of Maine and oversees the coalition's education and advocacy programs. James.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. Thank you to everyone who's joining the call. Let me just get the share going here. And I'm going to just move into full screen. Maybe I'm not going to go into full screen. There we go. Great. Well, this afternoon, I'm going to talk a little bit about speed and speed control from a somewhat different perspective, from the perspective of, well, hold it a second. Technology is always finding a way to complicate our lives. Beg your, just going to go into this mode. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of things that the Bicycle Coalition of Maine is doing to try and address speeding behavior, which is something that we hear about constantly from folks out in the field. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a social marketing campaign called Slow Me Down and a demonstration project campaign that we call Imagine People Here. Give you a quick agenda. I'm going to talk a little bit about why we decided to start an anti-speeding campaign, talk about the Slow Me Down campaign, plans for year one, which we're just finishing up right now, and plans for year two. Talk a little bit about the traffic calming demonstration project effort, and then I'll be available to take any questions you may have. I'd like to, from the onset, emphasize that the work that we're doing with these social marketing campaigns it really grows out of a partnership that we've had with the Maine DOT for many years, but most recently, since 2017, we've been involved in an effort called Heads Up, which is a pedestrian safety initiative focusing on 21 communities across the state, which are the highest population densities in the state, and which, you know, unsurprisingly have the highest numbers of pedestrian crashes. The entire effort was launched in response to like 3 years running of record high pedestrian fatalities in Maine, and the Maine DOT decided that, well, we needed to do something. And the Bicycle Coalition of Maine, which was already doing a lot of education work for the DOT, was very happy to jump in as a facilitator for the effort. So the first question to ask is, why launch an anti-speeding campaign? And I think that, you know, the first two presentations were great in terms of sort of setting up my presentation and some of the issues that I want to talk about. Nationally, about 26% of all traffic deaths in 2018 included speed as a contributing factor. That comes out to about 31% of all traffic deaths in Maine include speed as a contributing factor. I seem to recall Jeff saying New Hampshire was 38 or 34. You know, the numbers in these somewhat rural, low population states are small. I mean, we're talking 42 persons who died in Maine in crashes in which speed was an important contributing factor, still a significant number of folks. And the good news about speeding deaths is, in the research that I've done, you know, the number of total deaths attributed to speeding is trending somewhat modestly downward. And doubtless some of that trend is the result of safety improvements to protect people who are in the cars. The bad news about speeding deaths, however, is that bike ped deaths are hitting a 30-year high. Deaths of people walking increased by 35% alone between 2018 and 2008 and 2018. And speed is always a contributing factor in a bike ped crash, as even small increases in speed make a crash more lethal. And those wonderful improvements to motor vehicle safety are doing a great job protecting occupants in the vehicles, but there's some evidence that's emerging that large truck and SUV designs in particular, with those big blunt front ends, are proving especially deadly to people walking or bicycling. You get hit by a very flat-fronted large pickup truck at any kind of speed, and your risk of serious injury or death is, of course, you know, quite significant. Other reasons to launch an anti-speeding campaign are, you know, simply that norms around speeding seem to have changed significantly, and I thought that some of Bill's comments were spot on. It seems like driving 5 to 10 miles over the speed limit is the accepted norm. People do, I think, view, I wish I had this statement written. I'm going to remember Bill's comment. It seems like the speed limit is often treated as a, you know, a minimum limit, not a maximum limit. Just it's ubiquitous. People going over the speed limit 5 to 10 miles an hour in all contexts. Of course, cars are smoother, quieter. They have better brakes. They're safer than ever for occupants, as I mentioned. And I think that this combination of factors makes drivers believe that they can handle driving fast safely. And again, some of the comments that Bill made about enforcement, clearly there's an argument to be made on the part of the drivers that, well, I didn't crash, so I must have been safe. That may be true for you in the car, but I think it's a challengeable statement with respect to everyone else around you. Another reason we wanted to talk about controlling speed is, we're encountering more and more road designs that seem to encourage speeding. And I thought a lot of Bill's comments about coming up with a credible speed, were again spot on. If you've got a road that has a 15-foot lane and it is posted at 25 miles per hour, people are going to just feel ridiculous driving at 25 miles per hour in that context. And so we run into a situation where the actual design of the roadways are making it easier for cars to go faster. This is one of the things that needs to be addressed in some of the design work. And like Russell and Jenna's comments about, looking for at what the road is supposed to do, should be one of the big contributing factors in the design of the road. But frequently we find situations in which roads are basically built for speed. I mean, this is Main Street in Westbrook. This road is 47 feet wide. The travel lanes are 15 miles per hour, posted at 25. Speed studies that we were involved with that were actually conducted by Westbrook Police found that 60% of the traffic on this corridor exceeds the posted speed limit. And why not? I mean, it's very comfortable to go fast here. It's got a 15-mile-per-hour lane. There's plenty of room for, making adjustments and carrying a good head of speed. But this is a downtown context, and we heard a lot of people complaining about this speed problem there. A lot of people feeling that because cars are going well above the speed limit in many cases, they're not yielding consistently at crosswalks. And so speed, especially in residential and business context, downtown contexts, can be really problematic to the free flow of vulnerable users, people walking, bicycling, using wheelchairs. So the other issues, of course, in Maine, and I'm sure this is true in New Hampshire, law enforcement is spread thin. They can't be everywhere all the time. They've got plenty of other things to do. In Maine, I've heard stories of police departments in some of the big metro areas that are 15 to 30 officers down. With COVID, we just lost 11 firefighters in Portland this week. And so the staffing issue becomes an issue. That's, of course, a fire department issue, but similar things that are occurring in police departments. Police departments ultimately seek voluntary compliance with speed limits. And we felt that perhaps we can help with that, maybe a social marketing campaign that tries to get people to voluntarily adopt different behaviors would be a way to kind of get better conduct on the roads. And so this kind of is our two-pronged approach to behavior change. We're running sort of an education-based social marketing campaign that we call Slow Me Down. And then we're doing some things to change the geometry of the roads that will also slow drivers down. And, the goal is, of course, to come up with changes in behavior that stick. So the Slow Me Down campaign is a multifaceted social marketing campaign. We created a sign-on, we wanted to give people the opportunity to do something, not just to, say that they were going to slow down. So we created a little sign-on letter. We don't call it a petition. It's a letter that is, basically expressing support for traffic calming, just more sane driving in especially residential and business areas that we're going to be sending out to municipal leaders later this year. And we targeted municipal leaders because, the Maine DOT really views their customers as the municipalities. And we felt that if this message was coming, if we were getting the message to municipal leaders that a lot of people in town wish things were slower, and the municipal leaders were communicating with the DOT about road design in particular, we might be able to get some changes made in the sort of default processes by which roads are designed. We also created stickers and infographics, the whole kind of suite of materials that would normally accompany a social marketing campaign. And the sticker to me is something that's super important, because the sticker is something you put on your car. It says "Slow me down." I'll show you one in a second. And it provides a very obvious sign that you are part of the constituency that would like to see people going a little slower. I'll show you some infographics shortly. We have lawn signs, and we're beginning to roll out more and more community volunteer support to help them make their communities slower and safer places. So the three terms in the sign-on letter are, basically we want to create a new social norm, and we want to get back to a point in time where it's okay to drive the speed limit. It's okay to actually go 3 miles per hour under the speed limit in residential and business contexts. And we try to encourage people, if it's a 30 mile per hour speed zone, drive 27, particularly if it's a place where pedestrians, bicycle riders are likely to be. The letter, as I mentioned, also tries to express support for roadway designs that have narrower travel lanes, more raised crosswalks, and other geometric features that make it less comfortable for drivers to go fast. And we want to do more local street speed reduction actions, including traffic calming installations, which I'll show you some more of shortly. COVID made things a little weird in the outreach. We're seeking only 500 signatures this year. We're approaching that goal. We're about 400 right now. And we're going to be rolling out year 2 in 2021 to go on with this. One of the things that the sign-up form provides is a chance for the participants in the campaign to make a statement, again, to vent a little bit and to articulate why this is an issue that matters to them. And this is just 5 quick statements that show people responded to these this call for making a statement very strongly. We have hundreds of similar statements. Again, the lawn signs were intended to be put up on a roadway. So, in a residential context, you see those little, those neon little froggy guys with the sign that say, slow down, or drive like your kids live here signs pop up all over the place. So this is sort of a riff on that idea with our own branding, Slow Me Down. And the lawn signs have just recently gone into production, and they are proving to be pretty popular. Sent out several dozen almost immediately upon receiving them. And then on the right in this slide, you can see the bumper sticker, which provides a little bit of an explanation as to why you're actually not doing 5 miles over the speed limit. You're actually at the speed limit or under. And I used to work in public health, and they talk about environmental change as being important as to create a kind of context for people to operate in and live in and respond to. And the idea behind both of these elements is to create that environment out in the public space so people see, oh yeah, there is support for people driving more sanely, more slowly. We've also come up with a whole suite of infographics that are primarily being disseminated using social media. So this just shows some classic stats about the risk of getting killed at various speeds. Some descriptions here of stop times, bundling together reaction time and braking distance, showing that the faster you go, the longer it takes you to stop. This infographic is has gotten some good reaction. We've got a fear of height that it exceeds our fear of speed, and getting hit by a car moving at 45 miles per hour would be the equivalent of dropping from a 7-story building. And certainly no one would want that to happen. Certainly no one wants to get hit by a car moving at that speed either. Going faster tends to create a kind of tunnel vision effect and narrow your field of vision. This is what the infographic on the right shows. As Bill was talking about a reasonable and prudent speed, there's a similar clause in Maine law about speed limits. weather conditions should slow you down, but having driven in New Hampshire in snowstorms myself, I know that sometimes they don't slow you down, but we're trying to get, again, the norm established again that you should slow down when the weather's bad. And under that reasonable and prudent clause in law, you can actually theoretically be held accountable for going the speed limit in conditions when you should have been driving slower than the speed limit. And so we're trying to, again, just make people be a little bit more thoughtful about speed. For year 2, we're going to be doing everything we're doing in year 1, but we're going to try and move beyond recruiting individual people to whole towns. And the idea is to kind of mobilize some of the individuals who signed up this year and get them to help enlist their communities as Slow Me Down communities. In exchange for that, we're going to be able to offer access to a radar gun and a speed study website that we just created so that someone can be using a smartphone and a radar gun and just timing cars and immediately entering the values onto the webpage on the phone. And at the end of it, it spits out average speed, high, low, and 85th percentile values, which, as Bill mentioned, is critical to understanding what normative driver behavior seems to be. We're going to be offering traffic calming demonstration projects in association with our Imagine People Here campaign, which I'll talk about in a couple of seconds. New this year, we began doing yield studies based upon some studies and research done by Federal Highway. We adopted their methodology, and the idea there is to just, again, be able to quantify how readily drivers are stopping at crosswalks. And so yield studies and speed studies are really kind of key data points to understanding the safety of a downtown context, and certainly one that's got crosswalks. We offer technical assistance on road design and brainstorming ideas to come up with calmer traffic. In year 2 for the Slow Me Down campaign, we're going to be really leaning into our bike ped committees and offering them more support, helping them to set up forums, conduct walk and bicycle conditions audits, and other things as needed or requested by them. So far, the response to the Slow Me Down campaign has been, like I said, strong. We've got a lot of people signing up for it. It's been getting a lot of interest from our funders, and we're excited to continue to refine and improve it. Doing the wrong thing there. So other things we're doing to address speeding traffic, we're trying to change design speed of roadways without doing expensive, slow construction. And I assume many of you are familiar with the concept of tactical urbanism, which is, this is the quote right from Mike Lydon's book. Mike Lydon is a Mainer. Kind of interesting that he coined the phrase tactical urbanism, but the idea is basically that you pilot and you demonstrate that it is possible to calm traffic and make changes to the geometry of roads, at low cost, at high speed, and it can have profound effects. And really, this is the approach that New York City first adopted when they were working, when Gene Sadikan started making the changes under Bloomberg to New York City. They didn't just go out and rip up roadways and turn them into pedestrian malls. They did stuff in an iterative process of closing stuff using temporary materials and developing support, and then seeing what worked, and then hardscaping that finally. So it all just kind of boils down to using quick build demonstration projects of short to moderate duration to show people how possible, easy, and cost effective it can be to improve safety. We increasingly use the phrase demonstration projects rather than refer to this exercise as tactical urbanism, which makes people uncomfortable. It sounds like guerrilla warfare. The Maine DOT isn't a fan of that phrase, but they're actually fairly open-minded and positive about demonstration projects. So we've been doing this for, almost 7 years now. We really kicked it off in 2015. It really got going. Actually, in that number, I should have updated. We've done about 30 projects so far across the state. This is our very first project in South Portland where, we're actually just painting a bike lane using an athletic line striper. The public works director was pretty sure I was under the influence when I was operating that line striper. I assured him I was not. But I have since learned how to create straighter lines with that striper. The problem we had here was that you can see how close my reference marks are. We used a measuring stick that captured 6 feet from the curb edge to, where we wanted to put the line. And we did it too often and wound up catching every irregularity in the curb face possible. So it wound up being a little wobbly at first, but it was immediately used. You can see on the right here, we were barely done painting and a family rode down it and was super excited about it. This project became permanent the next year. I mean, City of South Portland immediately saw the value in it and has put it into their budget to restripe every year. One of the things they really liked about it was that it repurposed an excess amount of asphalt here where parking didn't exist. The roadway, the travel lane was so wide that cars were operating side by side as if it were a 2-lane situation. And so South Portland Public Works liked this concept for no other reason that it tended to narrow the travel lane and prevented that kind of side-by-side operation. It made it clearer that it was a single-lane context. Here's a project we did this fall rather, in Westbrook, that place that's got the very wide main street. This is becoming one of our go-to styles of installation where we create a kind of gateway context using delineators and an R1-6 sign. MUTCD and Maine DOT have guidance that, prohibits or at least restricts parking within 20 feet of a marked crosswalk. We were getting a lot of, reports from residents that, cars weren't stopping because they couldn't even see them due to parking right hard against the crosswalks. And so we just changed that situation with a little paint and a delineator. And this was a very well received installation. We did that at 5 intersections, or 5 crosswalks. Similar kind of treatment here in Bangor. There's a road, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but there's a road behind that Mercedes that prevented putting an R1-6 sign, which is the yield to pedestrian and crosswalk sign, in the middle of this intersection. So what we did is we have a single yellow delineator up by the stop bar to, again, just, create a little friction in the road using the delineators. We've also done bike lane projects. Here's a parking side buffered bike lane in Sanford. This has been repainted and this project has now progressed to the point where they're actually building a multi-use path to provide better access and functionality for bike and walkers on that corridor. This is a treatment that we're getting a lot of interest in and doing a lot of technical assistance and talking to people about. Michael Williams, who some of you may have heard of, talks about these as edge lane roads. Federal Highway talks about them as dashed bike lanes or advisory lanes. This is a treatment that is now in the rural design guide. We have been involved with, at this point, about 5 of these in Maine. This is kind of our flagship project in Scarborough, which connects a segment of the Eastern Trail. And the reception of this particular facility has been just completely positive. No reports of any crashes, no reports of problems from the police. And the residents really love it because it basically gives them a space, gives people walking, biking, and pushing strollers a place to be. And it tends to just calm the motor vehicle traffic. Here's another one we've done in Yarmouth. We just actually finished helping Yarmouth do another 2 of these on a couple of residential streets that people were concerned about speeds on. And again, traffic calming benefits, but also providing some clear space where people walking and bicycling might be able to. Sometimes we're simply doing changes in geometry. This is a project we did in Brunswick that changed the radius of a turn so that as people approach the crosswalk you see in the foreground here, they were moving more slowly. They were making a more deliberate turn onto the roadway. There was a little bit more friction, and they approached that crosswalk a little bit more slowly. This is right at Bowdoin College, and that was quite a busy location. We actually had some Bowdoin students very involved with that installation. Here's some more crosswalk treatments. The one on the lower left in Madawaska is interesting because we needed to create a temporary or some kind of safe landing if there's going to be a crosswalk, and probably it's the case in New Hampshire and nationally. It's certainly true in Maine that many crosswalks don't really meet best design practices. And what we wanted to do is see if there was a way to inexpensively improve the edge of road conditions so that you could create a kind of safe landing for a crosswalk in a space that didn't have a sidewalk or an ADA ramp and a landing for it. Saco is up on the upper right here. The delineators are intended to really make the at-grade curb extensions work. People were driving over those curb extensions constantly, and the town manager wanted to do something to kind of calm turning traffic down a little bit. And he helped actually install these delineators. It's excellent when you get photographs of a town manager actually helping you install delineators, and I've got those. Here's a demonstration project we did of a pedestrian refuge and some channelization in Lewiston as part of Build Maine. To the left is a parking buffered bike lane experiment that we did for Build Maine in cooperation with a few other folks. That was the first version of that experiment in the state. There's now a permanent version in Portland, and we are currently working with the city of Bangor to do an experiment on a stretch of road up there. Another demonstration project, an easy, quick thing to do was what we call left turn calming, center line hardening. And the idea is that we wanted to get people to follow the green line rather than the red line, and it could be done with delineators, or what we used is where these 4 delineators are in the center of the road. We actually wound up using a rubberized speed bump and attached that to the road. We did use the yellow paint and the delineators up where they left Bates Street, and we had DOT guys down there watching that, and that project got some attention and has come up as a suggestion from DOT a couple times. This is a project we did in North Yarmouth. We've been up here for 2 years. This is we got permission to put in a temporary crosswalk. You can see another temporary safe landing being put in. DOT was very supportive and helped us with signs. North Yarmouth DPW was very supportive in helping us get this done. This actually wound up being part of a traffic calming installation that had a profound effect on speed. We had a situation where only 33% of drivers were obeying the speed limit. After we put down the demonstration project and various gateways, we did a bunch of stuff with channelizers to create gateways, and again, just create friction in the context. We got 80% of cars obeying the speed limit afterwards. So that is really all I have to say. I'll have to take some questions. Again, what we're trying to do is address speeding behavior by both addressing education and ideas around speeding, but also to do some low-cost geometric changes to get some changes in driver behavior. Happy to take some questions, and if you want more information, you can visit our website. My address is jim@bikemaine.org. Thank you for your attention, and I'll turn it back over to Jeff at this time.
Thank you very much, Jim, for a great presentation, and to all of our presenters on a job well done. We do have some questions from the audience, and we do have some time left over here, about 15 minutes. So we can move into that. But before I do that, just a quick clarification for everyone on Bill Lambert's email address. It is correctly william.r.lambert, Lambert, @dot.nh.gov. Okay. So the first question that we have from the audience is, and in your experience, Bill, what countermeasures work best in your experience?
For dropping speed, I think countermeasures, we talk a lot more about target design speed now, or target speed, as opposed to design speed. Design speed tends to be for the lowest common denominator, and most of the population can go a lot faster than the design speed. Target speed is designing elements that can try to bring traffic down. So changes in geometry, narrower lanes, village settings. There's a lot of opportunities in village settings. On-street parking, any of that kind of friction tends to encourage lower speeds. I find those to be effective. We have found, if used appropriately, the driver feedback signs, the ones that say as you're entering a more dense developed area, a village setting, from a higher speed environment, the your speed is flashing at you tends to be effective. I think I've seen some studies where it can be as much as 5 to 7 miles an hour reduction. Of course, enforcement is a effective countermeasure, but resources are pretty tight for that. The traffic calming elements, certainly used in the right locations, would be out there as well. There's any number of traffic calming elements. I find roundabouts versus signals on a corridor, people have to slow down to go through a roundabout, where if they get green lights, even yellow lights, they tend to be encouraged to go faster. So any number of things like that can affect traffic speed. I think James was absolutely right when he talked about we've designed to make roads safer and more comfortable for the driver, but it encourages higher speeds.
Yeah. Very good. Thank you, Bill. Question for Russell and Jenna from the audience. Your findings include differences among so-called driving cultural practices. Does this mean they cannot be changed, or that attempts to change them will be met with great resistance?
I think it's a good question, because, when we talked about how we were studying Washington, speaking to you all in New Hampshire, there are differences that are geographic, just like that. I think the takeaway should be that we should be sensitive to these differences, that we should be paying attention to what's effective. Bill was talking about how different things are effective in different places in different amounts. So I think that we should be, in our approaches, we should be anticipating what would be acceptable and what would be effective in those different places.
Jenna, you have anything you want to add to that?
I think that Russell covered it very well. And I agree with the point that it's not necessarily that we can't change culture. We just have to be aware of it, and maybe different places respond better to different approaches.
Thank you very much. Question for Jim. What are some of the underlying issues with having an effective speeding campaign that encompasses safety messaging for both motorists and bicyclists?
Resistance to the message. Let me emphasize that, our campaign is not just pointed at bicyclists. We are the pedestrian advocacy organization for the state as well. Well, I've just been working on a slide deck, for another presentation before this one, and the comments that came in response to the traffic calming that we put in North Yarmouth this year is profoundly telling. I mean, drivers are very resistant to anything that creates friction and slows them down. They have a perception sometimes too that, the road is theirs, and bicyclists in particular need to register the devices and pay taxes in order to, have a say in how the roads are used. So, we are finding some cultural resistance, but we're getting a lot of support from people who walk and bike and also drive cars. I mean, the beauty of this campaign is that, even if you don't ride a bike, you do walk, at some point in your day. And even if you're a car driver, you can obviously benefit from safer conditions when you're walking to, a store, your workplace, or, a recreational site.
Thanks, Jim. Bill, question on towns wanting to do survey studies. Who do they contact? You're on mute, Bill.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
There you go. We prefer to have requests for speed limit evaluations come from town governing bodies because they represent more of a broader perspective. We find that everybody wants the speed limit to be lowered by their front door, but that doesn't necessarily agree with what the town's perspective would be. But the towns would reach out to me, and we would conduct a speed limit evaluation.
Okay. Do they need to contact for a speed study, or can they drop or raise speed limits on their own?
Yeah, that's a good question. On speed limits on state highway jurisdictions, and a lot of state highways are unnumbered roads that are classified as state highways. That would be under the Commissioner of Transportation's jurisdiction, delegated to me. Towns and cities have their own authority to regulate speeds on towns or roads within their jurisdiction. So city streets, and then class 5 roads that are within the city or town's jurisdiction.
Okay. And Jim, one for you here. Have you found that bicyclists tend to use the left side of the fog line due to debris collecting on the right? I don't know if that's, am I reading it right?
I think the question is so I'll restate it and you tell me if you think I got it, that, are most bicycle riders riding to the left or the right of a fog line?
Yeah, I think that's exactly how it should be read. Yep.
So that depends on a number of factors. First and foremost, probably the experience of the bicycle rider. A bicycle rider who is low experience is going to feel hesitant about sharing the lane. An experienced rider is more comfortable moving into a travel lane in any situation where that space to the right of a fog line is too narrow, or as you say, too full of debris. There's no hard and fast answer like what we see typically. I think lower skilled riders tend to be what some of the vehiculars call gutter bunnies, that they're always riding in the gutter of the roadway, right on the hard right-hand edge. That's not always the safest place to be because, your lane position says a lot about what you want a driver to do. That position says, pass me. And if you're in a context where the road is narrow, you could be getting passed with less than the 3 feet, required by New Hampshire and Maine law. And I love that New Hampshire has a kind of a graduated passing law. The faster you go, the more space you should give. So, it really varies on the rider and on the conditions at the edge of the road. If I get a 3 or 4 foot shoulder, I'll ride in it, particularly if it's clean. If I don't get that much space, I'm likely to be, to the left of the fog line and often right in the tire track of the lane.
Right. Debris in the shoulders there. Have you seen any efforts, increased efforts to remove the debris in any kind of frequency at all?
I don't. No, I don't see that as something that people are aggressively going at as a strategy to sort of create a more comfortable place for bicycle riders to operate, except in places where it's a little bit constrained. So the Casco Bay Bridge, which connects South Portland to Portland, has a bike lane on it. It's got a generous bike lane that's 7 to 8 feet wide. It also functions as a breakdown lane. That does get some debris in it from time to time. The bike community, myself included, will occasionally say, it's really time to get out there and sweep that. And I do give props actually to the city of South Portland and Portland that, although there are times when those bike lanes are a little bit cluttered, I do see those getting swept early in the spring, generally not too bad. It's part of my typical commute, so I'm sensitive to its condition.
Right. It's of great importance as we see, obviously, in your presentation, you touched on a lot of this, but we're seeing a rise in our pedestrian fatalities here in New Hampshire. We're up to 15 for this year so far. And as you say, speed is a factor in every one of them. So yeah, it's really, it's getting up there. So another question for you, Jim. How can pedestrian volume walking along a road be factored in setting speed limits? Oh, that's for Bill. I'm sorry, Bill. That was for you.
Great question. I know how to answer that. It should be factored in a lot. Let's hear what Bill's going to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mentioned the use of the web-based program US Limits 2 with Federal Highway produces, and I know one of the input values is whether it's a high or low pedestrian use area. So I know that there are algorithms that take that into account. I couldn't tell you what the algorithms compute or how it adjusts the end results. My experience with the program is that the 85th percentile carries a lot of weight, and things like crash rates and pedestrian volumes or pedestrian usage tend to affect the end result to some degree, but I couldn't tell you what the math is behind it.
Right. Jim, the question for you there prior to that was, what were some of the patterns you were seeing during the stay-at-home guidelines? Were you seeing more physical activity with increasing crashes and fatalities?
Well, that was the national experience for sure, that we were seeing more use, but there, higher speeds and more reports of serious crashes. Maine has not been having a terrible year for bicycle and pedestrian crashes. Not having a great year either, but it's not something that I can really correlate with the COVID experience. And if anything, if you factor in that more people were out walking and bicycling in 2020 than perhaps previous years, maybe comparatively, it's not as bad as it would have been had not, in terms of like number of crashes per population. I think more people started walking and bicycling in 2020 than we saw previously. Certainly saw huge upticks in bicycle ridership, but people walking on sidewalks, on quieter roads, all over the place. So we're finding a lot of support for the Slow Me Down campaign and the Demonstration Project campaign, because people are feeling like those measures kind of reinforce some new behaviors on the part of the general population getting out on the street.
Right. Yarmouth and Scarborough. It's another question that came in.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear it.
What's the ADT on multi-use advisory lane projects in Yarmouth and Scarborough?
I haven't counted it yet. So that's a great question. We actually just started a partnership with EcoCounter, which is a company that manufactures bike ped counters. And so I've only done a couple of sites so far. I got it this fall, and that's going to be something that we'll be looking at doing in the spring. But in the Scarborough location, anecdotally, every day dozens, running up to, hundreds per week would be my estimate.
Gotcha. Jenna and Russell, you talk about behavioral factors in New Hampshire. What were the most common demographic factors when it came to speeding, male in rural areas versus older drivers in a city, et cetera?
This is a great question. Our part of the study didn't look too deeply at demographics beyond what it was encompassed within our county typology. And of course, our incident level data only tells us that there was a crash here. And sometimes we had the age of the driver, but not always. So this is very interesting, but it comes down to data availability. So what I can give you at this point is largely speculative. Russell, do you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I just wanted to echo a point that Jenna, you made during the presentation, that this is we're working on a national study, working with national data, and the question you asked is the right question to be asking. We should be looking at the differences, but national data isn't really available. HSIS doesn't get into this level of detail, and it's really the only data set that we had available. We'd love to, I'm sure Jenna especially would love to get more information and break that all down, but those are the kinds of questions we ought to be asking and things we ought to be, demanding of these analyses.
Right.
We'd love to answer it more clearly. We can't right now.
Thank you. I got one more for Jim, and then we're probably going to have to close this out. Jim, how has Maine found snow maintenance has affected the demonstration projects or the use of delineators and bumpers?
We take them up.
You do?
Everything comes up. Everything's already up for the season. So we're putting stuff down typically with a butyl adhesives, which get us through 3 to 6 months. But come plow season, we take them up, and we haven't really solved the problem of how to make these things more permanent for the winter, and still be, temporary. So, yeah,
Gotcha.
we take them up, and it's a warm weather, no snow campaign.
Gotcha. Thank you. All right, we're about out of time, everybody. So I'd like to thank all of our presenters today for a job very well done, and all those who attended and participated in this speed panel. Special thanks to Jen, our PIO, for really putting this thing together. Thank you also to AAA Northern New England and Injury Prevention Center. Reminder to all, please take the survey at the end of the session so we can better serve you in future webinars. Join us next week for the 1 to 2:30 p.m. Discussion about impaired driving. Stay safe and be well always. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Have a great holiday.